Did you believe that she was happy?
Absolutely.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
She was extremely happy.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. As some of you may be aware, Detective Baumhover, the former lead detective in the Watts case, has broken his silence on the Watts case. He's posted a blog post on his experiences in terms of the Watts case, what sort of pushed him over the edge. And I'll put a link to that in the description in order for you guys to read that in full. I'm not really going to refer to it here, but I'm going to comment on it really broadly. And obviously, the commentary is based on investigating the Watts case. It's not really meant to go beyond that. It's not meant to be sentimental, and it's not meant to be sort of touchy-feely. Now, obviously, what happened to the detective is unfortunate, and we extend to him our sympathy and compassion. And it matters what happened to him. I mean, I think what did happen to him shows that he has a heart, that he's a human being. And if anything, I think this case kind of asks us, do we care about one another? Do we care about the people around us? When we see something like this, does it affect us? And I think it has. That's why there's been this outpouring of commentary and discussion and trying to figure out who this person is. Why is this happening? What is going on in our society? Why is there this annihilation within what looks like a fairy tale? And in a weird way, you can apply the same thing as the detective has to this pandemic. Why is this horror? Why is this nightmare overtaking our world that was a safe place where we were all doing whatever we were doing and everything was perfect, everything was fine, wasn't it? But was everything perfect? In terms of the Watts family as well. Was everything fine in terms of the Watts family as well? So what it looks like is the Watts case, what it did was it cut to the bone of the lead detective. It made him question his own beliefs, and probably this pandemic is doing the same to a lot of people as well. People who were on top of the world, or just, the world was their oyster, and suddenly it's all taken away from them. Why? What have I done to deserve this? Why is this happening to me? Well, it's actually happening to all of us. We're all in this together. And it's normal to feel those thoughts of despair. It's normal to feel depressed and anxious and all those kinds of things. But it's also important to get perspective and say, well, although those emotions are normal, what is actually going on here, and what can we do with it? And part of that sort of process is, I guess, where you say, how could a God exist if such evil was allowed to take root in the world? And so a question like that is going to put you in an existential crisis. You are going to question your beliefs. You are going to question your reality. You're going to question your faith, right? And in a way, it's good. It's good if that happens, because it may show that your reality wasn't aligned with reality, that we aren't living in a fairy tale, but we're not living in a nightmare either. So it is, if you catch a cold, just an ordinary sickness, there's a lesson in that, and the lesson is whatever you were doing, you did something that brought this upon yourself, in the sense of maybe you didn't get enough sleep, maybe you allowed stress to overtake you, maybe you allowed, maybe you worked too hard, or just didn't give your body a chance to rest. A simple thing like that. Now, I'm not saying it's your fault when you get sick, or it's the world's fault that this pandemic happened, or that it's anyone's fault that the Watts case happened. Just that things aren't completely disconnected. In other words, cause and effect aren't completely disconnected. In the same way, you can say, when you say cause and effect aren't completely disconnected, if you say, look how the virus transmits. It transmits by people coughing on one another. it transmits by people touching and interacting with one another if there's not social distance. So by recognizing the mechanism of how something works, you can kind of also break that mechanism and say, okay, put distance between people and the virus won't be able to transmit. Now you have the same thing in true crime. How is something transmitting through the mechanism of human psychology becoming criminal psychology? How can one break those viral triggers, if that's the word? And the same applies in terms of our anxiety. Now, if you're going to see things in a way, in a very black and white way, where you say, well, this is happening because God doesn't exist, or this is happening because of there's evil in the world. Well, hello, these things have been happening for quite a long time. Maybe it's just a case of not being aware of it, or not being aware of the mechanism. So I think that is an important thing to look at. And I realize some people might say, well, it's a very callous way of looking at it. Don't you have any feelings? Don't you have any sympathy? Yes, but sympathy doesn't really help us to understand the mechanism. And sympathy is the worst thing that you can have in a situation, for example, like a pandemic. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to come back to the Watts case, but somewhere on the news I heard about people collecting Easter eggs and giving them to old people. And it was a very sort of, oh, shame, sentimental story, a feel-good story. The reality, though, is that is the worst thing that you could do in a situation like that, is give old people chocolate, sugary things out of sympathy for them, and then eating them and then causing inflammation. It's just, on the one hand, you can say, well, it's nice that you care, but it's because of that disconnection in terms of being scientific, you're doing that absolutely the wrong thing in the situation. And so that's why it's so important to maintain perspective. It's not easy, but it's certainly important to maintain perspective. Now, to the detective's credit, the visuals of what he saw during the recovery from the Survey 319 tanks left an indelible scar on him, a trauma. I think if it had happened to anyone, those visuals would have been imprinted on people's minds. But what I want to say is the fact that he felt something and has been, I don't want to say broken, but been devastated, been traumatized by that, is actually a great redemption. It shows that he has a heart. It shows that he cares, that he's a sensitive person, that he cares about his fellow man, right? And that is important to have in a detective or anyone involved in law enforcement, is to be touched by the plight of one's fellow man. And that is also what's quite sad about the fact that currently I don't know if the detective is working, because the world needs someone who cares about other people, and he clearly does. So I hope that he will take heart from that. The fact that he cares so much is why he's so needed in the field. It just shouldn't be a situation where your caring leads to paralysis and leads to, as I say, this kind of existential crisis. Okay, Christianity does play an important role in the Watts case, and I want to touch on that lightly, even though I know it's kind of like a minefield. Someone is going to be offended. So if you think about the role Christianity played, and just stay with me when I say this, it's played a role in terms of the post-truth of the Watts case. And what I mean by that is, when you go into the Watts case, you don't really see much of Shanann being interested in religion, or it's not front and center. I'm not saying she didn't believe in God. I'm just saying that certainly wasn't something that stood out in a big way. You didn't have that with Shanann, you didn't have that with Chris Watts, you didn't really have that with anybody, not with Nicole Atkinson or Nicole Kessinger or anybody else. You had it a little bit, I think, with Sandy Rusek. I'm not quite sure what Cindy Watts's beliefs were, but in any event, in a broad stroke, one could basically say Christianity kind of took a back seat in terms of the Watts case until this happened. And then afterwards, then it suddenly became front and center to a lot of people. We saw Christianity mentioned by Sandy in the sentencing hearing. We've heard Frank talk about it, that you're evil monster. We've heard Cindy Watts also talking about God, and now the lead detective, and even Chris Watts himself. Now, what do you think of that, of Christianity, when Chris Watts talks about it, when Chris Watts talks about God? Is it a different situation for each person, or is it the same? And I think when you think about Chris Watts going to God after what has happened, it gives you a little bit of a sense of how each different person, in a way, can use Christianity almost like a convenience store. You take what you want out of it. And my question is, to what extent is it there and it is not being seen even when things are going well? Why do you turn to God when it's only when there's devastation? What happens on the other times when things are going well, when the fairy tale is happening? Do you not need God when there's a fairy tale? And I think that speaks a little bit to our world. There have been a couple of problems going on with our world for quite a long time, but people are too preoccupied with their fairy tales to care, right? To care about environmental aspects and all that kind of thing. So I'm not sure how belief in God helps the science aspect when it comes to true crime. And I can imagine an epidemiologist saying the same thing about a pandemic. And I don't mean that to say God is, irrelevant. I'm talking about God has given us the gift of solving problems, right? He's given us brains. And I know of a pastor who would never taken any medication his whole life, and then he went to Mozambique. And people told him, you need to take anti-malarials. And he didn't. And he came back from Mozambique and he got malaria. And they said, okay, well, now take anti-malarials. And he said, this is a test of my faith. I've never taken anti-malarials. And he got sicker and sicker. And I think he had five children. He had a big family. And they pleaded with him to take anti-malarials, and he didn't. And he ultimately died. It was sort of, he was saying, God is going to show everybody there's going to be a miracle through my life, and then he ultimately died. Now, you can look at that in different ways, but the way I look at that is to say, use your common sense. God gave you common sense. He gave us tools like medicines, like our minds and logic to figure things out. So figure things out. Don't just turn to him and say, God, save us. Figure things out. If you're in a problem, maybe God didn't create the problem, maybe we did, and maybe it's up to us to find the solution. Does that make sense? So I can see how it helps the coping mechanism, turning to God. I'm insignificant, I'm powerless, I'm helpless, God, please help me. I can see how that can help, in particular with Chris Watts. The problem is, aren't you forgetting all the things that led to this? And that is where being honest and sincere in a Christian way, I think, is helpful. If God has helped Chris Watts, why not the good guy in this case, Detective Baumhover? And Baumhover says in his blog post, I struggled greatly with the why part of the Watts case for a long time, but have since learned there may not be an answer, at least not in this earthly life. That's what he says. Now, can you imagine applying that to this pandemic? Saying, I was struggling with why this is happening, but maybe there's not an answer. We don't have that luxury. We don't have the luxury to sort of shrug our shoulders and say, well, we've got no idea why this is happening. So, maybe we will find out in the afterlife or something. I'll tell you why it matters. If we don't figure out why this is happening, it's going to happen again. It's the same with true crime. If you don't figure out why criminals do what they do, if you don't figure out why something is happening, you're not going to catch the next one. You're not going to know why it is happening, or how to change society for the better. So why is very important. I don't think the why in the what's case is very difficult to understand. I think if you open your mind and you dispassionately look at the case, you can see you're dealing with an introvert, you're dealing with someone who's a coward at heart, someone who doesn't know how to deal with confrontation in other people, and in something as fraught as a divorce and an affair, and not having money and so on. It is a terrifying prospect, something like a divorce. You know, it's the terror of the divorce along with the terror of losing this person that has suddenly meant so much to you. Of course, if you don't put yourself in Chris Watts' feet or in his shoes, none of that's going to mean anything to you. But then don't try to understand why. Don't really try to understand why. The way to understand why is put yourself in someone else's shoes. And they are not you, they are somebody else. But there is an answer. It's not as though there's not an answer. And the answer lies in human psychology. It's as simple as that, in the dynamics and all that kind of thing. And in the same way, Baumhover has turned symbolically to God, to say, well, God, I give this to you. This is too big for me. And in you is a kind of a why. You know, I don't know why this happened, and I put that unknown onto you. You know, God works in mysterious ways. In the same way, Chris Watts behaved in a symbolic way, where he wanted a fairy tale. A fairy tale is a symbolic thing, and he wanted to get rid of the nightmare that he was in, which was to him, his family. He was in a situation that to him was a nightmare. And everyone else looking in don't see that. They don't see the debt. They don't see the obligation and all those things. And they don't want to see it. They want a black and white answer. But life's not like that. Things are connected to one another. People are connected to one another. So Baumhover links the chaotic aftermath of the Watts case to the current pandemic and asks, why is this happening? He doesn't have an answer. It has something to do with God's will or our free will. That's the detective's view. Why is always a very difficult question, and to find the answer requires introspection. It requires courage and resilience. The truth is hard. Some, when they look for the truth, when they look inward, they find God. Is God or the devil an adequate answer for why things happen, would you say? I could sign off there, but I want to add kind of a postscript to this, which is probably stating the obvious. But for me, what is very unfortunate with the lead detective is he is agonizing over something that in a way is not real. Now, I realize that sounds insensitive, and it sounds almost like it's minimizing what happened. But let me explain what I mean. Watts didn't mean for his children's bodies to be recovered. He certainly was going to recover them himself. If he had succeeded in what he was doing, their bodies would have completely dissolved and kind of disappeared, right? So when they died, so after he'd committed this horrible crime, when they died, they didn't appear as they did when they were recovered. Does that make sense? So the same thing happened with Kaylee Anthony. When Kaylee died, she didn't appear the same as when her body was found. Does that make sense? She wasn't a skeleton. There wasn't a skull. There was just this little girl. Obviously, when you see the end result, it's horrifying and it's the stuff of nightmares, but that isn't what actually happened at the time. Kaylee didn't die out there in that forest. There was a different circumstance. The same with the Watts case. Personally, I don't believe the children even died at the well site, but that's a different story. I probably opened a can of worms simply by saying that, but I understand that it's probably a difficult reality to unsee once you've seen it. In other words, this whole thing of the children being recovered from the well site, but they didn't go into the well site alive. When after they had died, they didn't look like they looked like after they came out of the oil, if that makes sense. So I realize it's difficult to unsee or separate from the reality he saw, the detective saw, especially after seeing it. Probably that's why he's struggling to get perspective on this case, because of the scene at the end. In effect, though, the chemical processes aren't really related to the crime, or even to Chris Watts himself. One can say that this thing of oil on bodies and one's body being destroyed by, eaten up by oil or whatever, that graphic, horrible image is a symbolic for the monster or the evil or the darkness of this world that eats away at our innocence and our vitality. And that is something that is a disturbing thought, that all this kind of thing happens. But I do think the counter argument to that almost naive and almost childlike sense where you say, why is this happening, is that saying where they say evil happens when good men do nothing, right? And if we apply that idea to the Watts case, and you say evil happens when, the evil in the Watts case to an extent was that debt that wasn't being paid, that debt that was accumulating, that was a darkness overtaking the whole family, right? And so why didn't good men do anything? In terms of the Watts family, why was that situation allowed to get worse? In terms of the affair, evil happens when good men or women do nothing. Think about what that means in terms of the affair. And in terms of Chris Watts himself, when he felt these murderous impulses, he knew that he was going into a dark area, and yet he allowed the darkness to overtake him. Evil happens when good men do nothing about what is happening. And one can say the same thing about this pandemic. People can say, this evil was slowly coming into the world, and how did we respond? By saying it's just like the flu, it's no big deal. It's nothing to really worry about. That is how evil happens. And that is the problem we are all faced with, is how do you deal with reality, the reality of this world? Do you say, well, I've never had to deal with this before, I've never taken anti-malarials, I'm not going to do it now? Or do you use your intellect, you use the tools, the God-given tools God has given you, and you do something about your situation. You respond to your situation. I mean, that is the sign of an intelligent species, is something happens in your environment, something happens in your world, and you change. You do something else. You do something else that doesn't perpetuate that original situation. If you can't do that, what happens? Breakdown, failure, existential crisis. So in other words, what's the way out of the existential crisis? Respond appropriately, respond to reality, and also respond to the amount of reality you can respond to. Doesn't that make sense? So I hope that's been helpful, and I realize it's a very touchy subject. I hope you guys can respond to it in a measured way, and I know it's definitely going to be a controversial episode, this, but I do think it's important to touch on some of the deep stuff in terms of the Watts case, not the shallow conspiracies and the silly sensational stuff. And in that respect, I really welcome Detective Baumhover's honesty and sincerity in this regard. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, wash those hands, and I'll see you guys next time.